The problematic prince. Erna Hardy was a well-mannered girl. Now that she grew up into a polite lady, it was her turn to be a refined wife. To sum up the content of the lengthy paragraph, it was a very different reply than what she expected, as it especially destroys her chance to be a good wife to a decent man. No way. Erna's eyes, which had been looking down at a letter for a long time, were full of determination as she said to herself, "This is ridiculous." Even on second thought, the conclusion was the same. Standing up from her seat, Erna walked up to the window. It was an afternoon when the dazzling rays of the spring sun were pouring in, but it felt depressing. Opening the panes with a squeaky sound, she sat on the frame, holding her knees close to her chest. Located high above the ground, the village's landscape could be seen from the mansion of the Badens. Erna's gaze, briefly pausing on the single chair lying on one side of the garden, slowly wandered over to the gentle slope of the orchard, streams and hills covered with yellow cherries. The world was not interested in one man's misfortune. It obviously made her uncomfortable. Even if she had a loving family and was on the verge of being kicked out of a place full of life, a world full of joyous spring was beautiful. If grandfather heard this stupid complaint, they'd laugh. She felt relieved, a bit of cynicism added to it. Lady Erna. The voice of Mrs. Grebe, a housekeeper, reached her from the far side of the hallway. "Yes, I'm here. I'll be right there," Erna declared, hurriedly getting off the window frame. It seemed like it was already time to have lunch. Her disorganized clothes were tidied. She was fine. While heading to the dining room on the first floor, she murmured as if memorizing a spell. The ridiculous letter was hidden deep inside the drawer so that it could not be seen. "It's okay. Everything is going to be fine. Have you seen a lawyer, Erna?" Baroness Baden, who had been rambling about today's weather and new sculptures, came up with it only after she finished eating.
No, Grandma.
"Not yet," Erna answered in a stern tone. She tried to stay calm, but her eyes showed an indescribable nervousness. "I'll make sure to meet one before this week ends." Sunlight that was penetrating through the glass of the window was falling on Erna, lighting up her neck and waist. Her heart was hammering loudly, her lips were drying up, and her fingers were curling up into a fist. Fortunately, the Baroness nodded without further questioning. "Yes, you should. I wish I could find a way." A gentle sigh permeated into the air of an overly still room. Erna looked up at her grandma as she stared at her hands on her knees. She had become old and frail in a month. She had lost her husband overnight and would hand over all her little assets to a relative who was no better than others. So how could Erna tell the truth? Her lips were stubbornly sealed, not to reveal the truth. Actually, she met a lawyer earlier. The answer that came was no different from what Erna already knew. Having no son, Baron Baden's property was to be inherited by his nephew. Erna had long known that such ridiculous laws existed was upsetting and unfair, but if there was no way to change the law, they had to come up with a countermeasure. It was about time that Erna began to raise money by increasing her work little by little, so that she could buy this house in a fair manner again one day, but that one day arrived too early, and the money she collected was not enough. Unfortunately, that is how the inheritance law works, Miss Hardy. The lawyer consistently responded insincerely whenever Erna begged for a different way. For now, it would be best to explain the situation to Mrs. Baden and ask for mercy. That afternoon, Erna wrote to Thomas Baden. She had to do it, unable to find a suitable lawyer. And today, Thomas Baden's reply turned a faint-hearted repentance into utter despair and anger. "Everything will be fine, Grandma. Don't worry too much." Erna, who lied, gave a smile to reassure her grandmother and got up from the table before putting on an apron. She was very skilled at helping Mrs. Grebe, who arrived slowly, to organize the table. Everything was not fine. While scrubbing the dishes, Erna accepted the truth that she could no longer avoid. It was not an exaggeration to say that the estate of Baron Baden, a fallen aristocrat, was now only this house in the countryside. However, the house was soon to be occupied by Thomas Baden, the legitimate heir, and he was going to sell this land without even a moment's hesitation. Erna breathed deeply in her suppressed anger. Thomas Baden said he could fully understand her. However, because he had his own reasons, he could not delay the disposal of the house until Baroness Baden died. She wouldn't have felt this way if he only had expressed such a determined refusal. The ridiculous reply contained one compromise offered by Thomas Baden. If Erna Hardy married him, he was willing to be particularly generous. After washing the dishes, Erna headed to the backyard with her apron rolled up. When she sat on her grandfather's chair under the beautiful ash tree, her eyes burned up in tears. The view of the beautiful spring landscape became hazy, but she held back her tears with her eyes wide open. She didn't want to cry because of such a person. A father who treated his helpless relative, who was not yet living up to her age. "Father," she muttered without realizing. She had forgotten about him for a long time, but she was sure he still existed in this world. "Yes, father." Blinking her eyes, she leapt from her chair. The strings of the unclasped apron fluttered along with the spring breeze. What woke Bjorn was the noise outside, which even closed panes and thick curtains could not block. The loud cheer that began in the river flowing next to the grand reservoir filled the dim bedroom. He tried to sleep again with his head buried under a pillow and a cushion, but he finally gave in. "Peppy crazy bastards." Bjorn walked out of his bed, spouting abusive language. When he slid the curtain covering the western window, he spotted a group of people practicing rowing on the other side of the river. Every summer, on River a Bit, which flowed across the city and into the sea, a rowing game of nobles was held. It was hard to do anything because the summers were too long to hold up buttery parties and gossip, but the problem was that the river was close to a large reservoir. It was difficult to get accustomed to this terrible noise from the spring when the practices usually began. Leaning obliquely against the window, Bjorn's disgusted gaze sat on a narrow boat, glaring at the enthusiastic boys atop. "You could rather have sex if you couldn't control your overflowing energy, you maniacs. It would be a much more beneficial hobby than a fleeing task when they needed to sweat unnecessarily. In the worst-case scenario, they could even leave at least one child to make a minor contribution to the rise in the power of the kingdom's growth. Of course, it would be a headache in personal history, but the tragedy of the uncontrolled fools was none of his business." Taking a sip of warm water from the table, Bjorn turned around, running his fingers through his messy hair. He rang the bell that called his butler, Greg. Greg, who was well aware of the reason for the bell ringing at noon, rushed to report before his master asked. The number of the teams participating this year increased, which made it a little noisier. Chuckling at the tragic news, Bjorn added, "They're very enthusiastic about Leonid Denister about winning the championship and a bunch of lunatics being bridesmaids. Would you like to move your bedroom?" "Nah, it's fine." "Then I'll prepare the meal. Just fruits." To the balcony. Bjorn, leaving a short order, entered the bathroom. After a long shower of cool water, a table on the balcony of the bedroom awaited him. He stared at the view under his feet, drinking a cold whiskey soda. The great fountain of water, known as the specialty of the Scharen Palace, was dancing. Gold statues decorating the fountain and breaking water streams glimmered under the cremated spring star. Bjorn's gaze reached the waterway where the stream of water flowed past the fountain and followed the slope of the stairs connecting the Grand Park and the garden. There was still a loud roar coming from the river a bit, which reached the end of the long waterway. "His Highness, the prince has finished eating," Greg, who came in a hurry, said when Bjorn was about to place his glass on the table. After wiping the remaining water off his finger with a napkin, Bjorn nodded shortly, picking up an apple. Shortly after the butler left, Leonid entered the bedroom, striding up and sitting opposite to him. It was obvious that he ran away from the rowing practice. "Your Highness, the Crown Prince." Bjorn greeted his younger brother elegantly, contrary to his arrogant posture with his legs crossed. When his head flicked, water droplets at the end of his platinum strands dripped down. With Leonid staring at him as if amazed, Bjorn looked down at the great fountain in the garden. The crunchy pulp he took from the fruit was as sweet as the scent of flowers hovering in the wind. "Tell me what you need." After the servants had the prince's share of the ride withdrawn, Bjorn faced Leonid with squinted eyes. Scharen, where the Grand Duke's palace was located, was a resort city where nobles of Lechen visited to spend the summer. It was still early, but the prince, who was crazy about coordination, moved to the Scharen Palace early on and added in his brother's daily life. With a light sigh, Leonid replied by dropping the newspaper he had brought on the table. The first page of the famous tabloid, which specialized in social gossip, contained a large picture of its regular customer, Bjorn Denister. "Is the royal poisonous mushroom all right?" Bjorn's forehead crumpled at the ridiculous headline. "Poisonous mushroom. You didn't know? I thought it was your new nickname. Poisonous mushroom." After a slow review, Bjorn laughed, putting down the paper. However, the fact that they put a pretty nice picture was a praiseworthy article. "Gladys is coming back to Lechen." Leonid, who was still looking at the side view of Bjorn's face, carefully opened his mouth. "Gladys." The scandal caused by the name erased the smirk off Bjorn's lips. The tabloid's article, which he read thoroughly, also contained the news about Gladys Hartford, the Princess of Lars, who decided to spend the summer in Lechen. A beautiful princess who was once loved by all of Lechen, but the return of the unfortunate woman, who was betrayed by her husband and lost her child, was indeed a gossip that people could go crazy about. With her ex-husband, who was once a prince but was now strategized as the poisonous mushroom, a more plausible picture would be created. "Are you going to appeal, Bjorn?" "Let's see." Bjorn's attitude was serious enough to make Leonid laugh. Bjorn, who stopped taking a bite off the apple, wiped the juice from his fingers while leaning back on the chair. The eyes that did not contain much emotion were just calm. Spring. It was a good season for poisonous mushrooms to grow. The train to Schwerin entered the platform on time. It was around the time when the blue light of dawn had dissipated and the morning had just begun to arise. Erna, who was standing in a posture as stiff as a stick, walked up to the front of the carriage. The rural station, where the first train had just arrived, was quiet. After a few passengers hurried to board, Erna was the only person left on the platform. "Hey, miss, aren't you going to ride?" The blunt question posed by the station master awakened Erna, who had been in a daze. Yes." Erna turned her eyes from looking around anxiously and faced the station master. Her hand that gripped the trunk with all her might began to tremble slightly. "You must have found the letter by now." Erna's eyes, recalling the past incident, deepened. She couldn't bring herself to tell her grandmother that she was going to meet her father. It was because she knew well that her stubborn grandmother, the Baron of Baden, would rather be left out on the streets than seek help from her son-in-law, whom she regarded as an enemy. Erna, who had been struggling, eventually left behind a letter explaining the situation and took the path not quite ladylike. "Father." As she repeated the strange name that gave her a foreign feeling, my heart beat faster. Their last meeting was at her mother's funeral, so it has been 11 years since she had been there. She knew that he was no different from a stranger. No, he was inferior to others, but for now, he was Erna's last hope. Maybe she'll get hit at his doorstep. Erna grabbed the trunk and took a deep breath, then raised her head to face the train standing in front of her. A heavy black iron gleamed menacingly in the morning sun. "If you don't ride..." "Oh no." Erna hurriedly shook her head and shouted. Her blue eyes gleamed with determination. "I'll ride, I will ride. Love fate." Recalling that sentence that was the keynote of her life, Erna took a trembling step. This world doesn't care about a person's misfortune, so one's life must be managed by one's own strength. It is better to love all the fates that have come your way, since nothing can be changed by struggling with self-pity. If you love, you will work hard, and doing your best is better than resignation in any case. If it was a given fate to hang on to even a glimmer of hope, Erna was going to love that fate as well. In any case, Viscount Hardy was Erna Hardy's father, a person who has the duty to take responsibility for his child, but a person who has neglected that duty for a long time. But even now, that person has to fulfill that duty. Leaving behind the station master with a fierce expression, Erna hurriedly got on the train. Following the urgent gesture, the hem of her fine floral muslin dress fluttered. After leaving her hometown holding her mother's hand, after 14 years, Erna was returning back. It was the beginning of a long journey. Bjorn put down the teacup slowly. In a flawless and elegant movement, he made a languid posture, crossing his long legs more prominently. "Are you listening to me now?" The bewildered voice of a woman disturbed the stillness of the parlor, which was full of spring sunshine. "Why? You don't want to answer? Maybe that article is real. Is it? Is it?" The voice of the woman who was angry was raised even more. With the hand that gently wiped his still dry face, Bjorn grabbed the teacup again. As he drank another sip of the properly cooled tea, he felt that his dazed mind was clearing up.
Bjorn.
The woman who couldn't beat him got up from her seat. A single ray of sunlight flowing through the window lit up the woman like a stage light. He was dressed perfectly, unlike the woman who had run.
Bjorn.
The woman who couldn't beat him got up from her seat. A single ray of sunlight flowing through the window lit up the woman like a stage light. He was dressed perfectly, unlike the woman who had run from the capital to Scharen at less than noon. Bjorn raised his eyes, now accustomed to sunlight, and looked at the woman. His gray eyes gleamed with a subtle brilliance like opal. It was around dawn when he returned home, and after a bright morning he took a shower and threw himself on the bed. So at least it's midnight for Bjorn. That means it was never a good time to wake up like this. Bjorn opened his eyes, which was closed slowly, and leaned deeply against the back of the chair. From the window facing the river, the cheers of the group practicing rowing began to be heard. Good fucking morning. With a sigh mixed with laughter, Bjorn grudgingly picked up the newspaper thrown by the woman who approached him recklessly. The front page of a tabloid, such as the one that Leonid brought a while ago, was decorated with articles today. Rumors of reunion between the former crown prince and his wife, the private information obtained from the closest aides. Bjorn glanced at the grand headlines and large photos of himself, and began to read the article with narrow eyes. According to reports from close associates who requested anonymity, the atmosphere between the two was unusual. It is never wise to forgive an ex for such a shameful act, but Princess Gladys, who is weak at heart, seems to be swaying. Thanks to this, it is expected that Lachin's social circle will be hot this summer. Something like that, carefully written nonsense filled the space. It was evident that the newspaper was bad at everything but the ability to pick out the best photos. Bjorn smiled and put down the newspaper casually. The woman's face, who had been watching him while holding her breath, was now red with a sense of contempt she couldn't hide. You don't even have the heart to explain this, right? The woman now clenched her fists with tears in her eyes. Let's break up. With a sharp voice, she exclaimed, as if making a solemn declaration. With a teacup between his lips, Bjorn looked up to face the woman. I don't think there is any reason to continue this relationship any longer. I think I need to get engaged before the end of this spring. Contrary to the triumphant tone of her voice, the woman's eyes showed an impatience that could not be hidden. Bjorn stared at her slowly. She was not a bad lover. She was moderately elegant and moderately vulgar, and above all, it was because they were well aware of the premise of their relationship, where they would return to their own lives after having a refreshingly enjoyable time.
No.
He thought that until she came over angrily yelling about Gladys Hartford's name in a cheap tabloid newspaper. Congratulations on your engagement, Miss Perez. Bjorn nodded happily and smiled. The whisper that flowed out along was soft and gentle. I beg your pardon. The woman, who blinked slowly, asked back with a shocked tone. Cold-blooded, selfish to the bone and wretched. How could you do this to me? Well, you were the one who said goodbye. The tip of his long finger gently stroked the rim of the teacup. I've accepted it. Isn't that what you wanted? As if asking a question, Bjorn tilted his head. His hair, which had been swept away randomly following the movement, flowed down. She only bit her lips. The woman did not respond at all. Bjorn stood up from the table, leaving the woman with a red face. Wait! The woman screamed at him. Bjorn, who stopped walking, responded by throwing his gaze over his shoulder. Is that all you have to say? That's all you have to say to me? The lady of the Perez family now had a face close to crying. Even so, the face was still beautiful, but he felt no particular emotion. Bjorn slowly turned towards his former lover, who was not bad, and he bowed his head politely. It was a dignified greeting that did not go well with his loosely dressed gown. I wish you good tidings and at least a count. His lips, which had a smile that seemed even mild at first glance, gleamed red in the sunlight. Leaving behind the half-passed-out woman, Bjorn left the parlor. Mrs. Fitz, who stood guard outside the door, followed him like a shadow. "I'm sure you won't be trying to put me to sleep by singing a lullaby." The tip of Bjorn's lips curled softly as he saw Mrs. Fitz following her to the front of the bedroom door. "I can do whatever the prince wants, but unfortunately there seems to be trouble now." Mrs. Fitz, as always, replied to his jokes in a strict manner. As the crown prince's nanny, she was now in charge of managing the housekeeping of this Scharen palace. Even when she became an old lady with white hair, her upright personality did not change at all. "You have to leave for the train station soon." Train station. There is not much time left for the arrival of Her Majesty the Queen. Ah, it was today. It was then that Bjorn remembered the schedule. It was the day that his mother, who was invited to a charity party at the Royal Hospital, visited Scharen. The Queen's escort was, of course, him. Yes. Bjorn accepted the task with a light nod. "I'm ready." Passing through several cities, the train began to fill with more and more passengers. The compartment where Erna was the only one was already full. Erna, sitting close to the window, carefully observed the scenery flowing through the snow mixed with curiosity and anxiety. Countless passers-by and carriages were passing along the cobweb-like road between the dense buildings. Everything was so complicated and flashy. It felt like her eyes were spinning round and round. However, if I know the address, I can easily find it. Suppressing her nervousness, Erna struggled to persuade herself. Anyway, since it was the city where she was born and raised, there was nothing to fear too much. Although it's a place where she didn't live for less than 5 years, her hometown is still her hometown. While Erna was making up her mind once again, the train that arrived at Scharen Central Station, the final destination, stopped. Erna hurriedly packed her bags and left the cabin in the midst of the other passengers. The ribbon of the hat pulled taut under the chin, and the neatly braided hair swayed along the stride. But that proud look didn't last long. After going out into the hallway, Erna couldn't remember very well. She was pushed here and there and got off the train, and when she came to her senses and found herself standing on the platform, the crowd and the noise that made both ears tingle overwhelmed Erna for a moment. She tried to get out of this place somehow, but the more she did, the more Erna was pushed further and further away from the exit. "Come here. It's coming." When someone shouted loudly, the eyes of the people who filled the platform were all focused in one direction. Erna, who was holding the trunk she had almost dropped, also turned her head towards it. It was almost at the same time she suddenly realized that she was at the forefront of a crowd of onlookers and found a tall man walking from the other side. Even in front of the crowd, like a swarm of clouds, Bjorn showed no signs of nervousness. From the moment he was born, he had been living in the interest of the whole kingdom, and it was familiar as if breathing. The slight discomfort that accompanied it was no different. "Stand back. Everyone back off." The roaring cries of the servants resounded through the crowded platform. Even in the chaos of disorder, the spectators slowly retreated, paving the way for the prince's procession. Bjorn kept his back and neck upright and took a refreshing step in strides. They even exchanged light eye-to-eye greetings with those who touched them as if they were passing by. It was a kind of habit that had been repeated over the years and got into the body. She, too, was nothing more than a crowd with such meaningless glimpses. It was thanks to the amazing behavior of the little girl that the time his eyes stayed a little longer. The woman in a rustic old-fashioned dress, wrapped in lace and ribbon, looked like she would believe she had lived through the last century alone. As if a dress full of floral patterns was not enough, the hat was also dangling in harmony. Passing by the woman, Bjorn turned his gaze once more, this time towards the man with the red-hot face. The man, who had been blaming the royal prodigal son with a strong point, staggered backwards. But Bjorn gave him a fair smile as well. Even in the midst of the chaos of criticism and admiration, he looked as if he had just gone out for an afternoon stroll. Capturing and throwing away meaningless faces, Bjorn proceeded leisurely toward the train that had just entered the platform. Knowing the address didn't help much. Unfortunately, Erna only found out after getting lost and exhausted from wandering. The clear darkness was slowly falling over the city as the sun had set. Erna staggered towards the fountain in the center of the square on Terra Boulevard. It felt like she could lie down like this, but she didn't forget to open the handkerchief before sitting down on the railing. For today, Erna wore the clothes she loved the most. It was a muslin dress that her grandmother gave her as a birthday present last year. Now, she didn't want to show my father well, but she needed to have proper manners and dignity like a lady. It was impossible to get those clothes dirty. Calmly and gracefully, like a lady anytime, anywhere. It was a life motto that her grandmother had kept for the rest of her life, and it was also a legacy she wanted to pass down to her granddaughter. Although she inherited the surname of Hardy, Erna Hardy, the unmistakable lady of the Baden family, had an obligation to uphold its value. While Erna was meticulously adjusting her outfit, the gas lamp in the square lit up. After finishing his work, the streetlight keeper got on his bike again and left for the next area. After a while, Erna got up again and packed her luggage after being immersed in the strange sight she had seen for the first time in her life. The pain in her swollen feet and legs disappeared spontaneously when she thought that she had to find a house before the night got deeper. With the sound of footsteps, Erna walked along the street dyed with the light of gas lamps. It was beautiful enough to make her forget the fearful and dreary feelings for a while at night, where petals falling in the wind fluttered like snow. Wow! Erna raised her head as she exclaimed like an innocent child. A white full moon could be seen through the branches. Last night, it was like the moon floating in the night sky. She looked through the window after tossing and turning because she could hardly sleep. The relief given by that natural fact was unexpectedly quite large. After holding her breath, Erna started walking down the road with a little more courage. And soon, she found the house in the address she had been repeating like an earnest prayer. An old-fashioned mansion at the western end of Terra Boulevard, the very Hardy girl that once used to be her home. Before ringing the doorbell, Erna adjusted her dress once more. She kept head posture straight and kept her smile as soft and sociable as possible. She didn't know how she would look, but it was, at least, good by Erna's standards. It's okay. Deceiving herself with a lie that she thought was already a lie, Erna reached out her trembling hand towards the doorbell. I really don't understand you. The chirping woman's voice pierced through the melodies of the upbeat chamber music. At that moment, Bjorn opened his eyes that had been slowly closed. Unlike Louise, who was excited, Bjorn's eyes looking at her sister were dry. You say Gladys is coming back. Don't you know what this means? Well, it's going to be a pretty unlucky summer, or something like that. The blunt answer, which was thrown away with a bright smile, sounded even more poignant due to his sluggish tone of drowsiness. Oh my gosh, how could brothers speak of Gladys like that? Gladys, whom my brother hurt and threw away. Louise was furious, as if it were herself who was insulted. Even with such a sister by his side, Bjorn calmed. It's not a bad spring weekend, except for Princess Louise, who whizzes around like an angry bee. "Brother, please, correct the mistake now." Louise now began to speak in a tone that seemed to appease even a child. Louise, who was also Gladys's friend, supported Bjorn's marriage more fervently than anyone else. After a tumultuous divorce, she turned into a more ferocious critic than anyone else. Of course, it's not the kind of fault that can be forgiven, but if Gladys forgives, I'm sure the two of the Duchess of Haina. Bjorn cut off his sister's words. Unlike his smiling lips, his eyes and tone were calm enough to give a sense of ingenuity. "It seems that the Duke is looking for his wife, but how about returning to your husband's side?" Bjorn blinked and pointed to the Duke of Haina, who was sneaking through the crowds of ladies beyond the hall. The terrace leading to the garden was crowded with men coming out to smoke cigars.
Bjorn.
"Here." Seeing a familiar face beckoning, Bjorn turned towards it. The crowd that normally should have been engrossed in a nonsensical discussion was quiet today. Some of the dogs were sipping their drinks with somber faces that looked like they were about to burst into tears at any moment. "The investment failed," said Peter, who held out a glass filled with amber brandy. Bjorn leaned at an angle to the railing and took a glass of wine. "Investment? I invested in foreign bonds, but it was a scam or something." Peter clicked his tongue and delivered the tragic news. Only lightly frowned, Bjorn showed no reaction. It seemed that the number of idiots caught up in the fanciful investment craze that had stirred up other social clubs for a while was greater than expected. "Thank you, my lord. Thanks to you, I am alive." Peter, who moved closer to Bjorn, lowered his voice and whispered. After receiving the investment information that appeals to his ears, he went straight to Scharen Palace. Because the orthodoxy of the social circles that Prince Bjorn must have had a gift from God, at least in two fields, women and money. That day, after hearing the explanation from Peter, who was excited, Bjorn summarized the situation with a concise answer. "Sick bastard." How insulting was that mundane word with a low voice. Peter Bergen almost committed a serious crime of assaulting the royal family. If it had been an opponent that could have been defeated, it would have certainly been. But how about? For a moment, he had to protect his property in exchange for becoming an asshole, so there was nothing that he couldn't bear. Besides, didn't he see a pretty big profit by investing in a steel company with the information he got from beating Bjorn? Just thinking about it made Peter feel like he could fall in love with that unlucky prince. How much did Bjorn earn as he earned that level of income, who only barely tasted it after entering the water? Anyway, one of the talents of rolling money was certain to be something close to a gimmick. It was one of the important reasons for continuing this friendship by enduring it even if it was dirty and disrespectful. "You must catch it by all means, Bjorn. It's a serious crime with no one or two victims, isn't it?" The heir of a countess, who made eye contact with Bjorn, began to weep and recite the names of the scammers. Most of them were children of noble families who were members of the fraternity, but there were also some rather strange names mixed in. Viscount Hardy lost almost all of his fortune. He's on the verge of committing suicide with a pistol right now. Hardy. The tedious grumbling ended with an unfamiliar name, perhaps the most serious idiot. After smoking a cigar, Bjorn turned towards the garden over the railing. Through the hazy smoke, the colorful spring flowers with the water rising to the fullest were seen. Bjorn's gaze, who was slowly admiring the scenery, suddenly stopped on the flower bed full of small white flowers. Lily of the Valley. Bjorn's eyes narrowed as he remembered the name of the flower. The bouquet Gladys wore at the wedding. Thanks to this, the Lily of the Valley, which was nicknamed the flower of the crown princess, was loved enough to cause a shortage for a while. Of course, its popularity faded in less than a year. Come to think of it, it was the flower that adorned the hat of the austere woman he saw at the station, that lily of the valley that has long since passed the fashion. Bjorn hummed the waltz from the hall and let out the long cigarette smoke once more.
No wonder.
Leaving the lily of the valley flower bed without any regrets, his gaze was now on the white moon hanging over the night sky. Even if he glanced at it, there was no luck. Like in one way or other, bankruptcy is imminent, and there is nothing you can't afford to share with your ex-wife's daughter. After all, your daughter is a child. Brenda Hardy screamed fiercely at her husband, who kept his mouth shut. Last night, she was so stunned that her mind, which had only been dazed, was starting to fill with belated anger. Walter Hardy was silent, only tilting his glass. "Are you listening to me now, husband?" "Hey, Viscount Hardy," Brenda Hardy exclaimed nervously and grabbed the bottle. Since he was scammed, he has been drinking all day and night, but today it's especially annoying and scratched her nerves. A person who said herself as the daughter of Hardy family has come to visit. Last night, just when the maid, who had come to her in a hurry, informed her, the Viscountess thought that some crazy person had appeared. Erna Hardy. If the maid hadn't added the visitor's name, she might have given her orders to throw her away with a rag or something. Annette's daughter appeared. Why, all of a sudden. Brenda Hardy was met with a jaw-dropping spectacle as she rushed to the place in disbelief. Erna looked exactly like her mother. It was as if Annette Baden, who had died, had come back alive. Of course, the ridiculous outfit was also surprising. "Honey, what are you going to do with that kid?" "Huh. I have to send her back." Walter Hardy, who had been acting like he was paralyzed across the river, finally opened his mouth. "You just have to convince her to listen and send her back. That's all, Brenda." It is very easy to say, "Yes, I can speak well. She came all the way here and made such an absurd request." Not a chance. Brenda Hardy snorted outright sarcasm. Erna wanted them to protect the country house of the Baden family. The girl's request was truly absurd and shameless. On top of that, with a very nervous face. Annette Baden spoke very well. Brenda Hardy had to use all her patience in order not to throw the girl out immediately. Erna looked like her mother so much that Viscountess addressed Erna as Annette. "Master, ma'am, breakfast is ready. Erna, please come down too." The maid's message, accompanied by a careful knocking sound, stopped Brenda Hardy, who was about to shout again. Leaving behind his new wife, Walter Hardy stood up. "Speak properly so I can understand and send her back." "It must be so." "Okay." They fed her and put her to sleep last night in order to keep the minimum morality. So Walter Hardy was determined to drive her out immediately. Anyways, he had no intention of adding a daughter who was acting like a debtor in a troubled situation. Obviously, this was his intention. Until he met Erna, who was quietly waiting in the breakfast room. When his eyes met, Erna hurriedly stood up from her seat. The morning sun coming in through the large window facing the garden was pouring down on her. Maybe it was because he was very drunk last night. It felt like he was seeing her for the first time. "Hello, father." Erna, who blinked her big eyes while holding her breath, came to say hello. It was a very clear and soft voice. Father." With her head tilted slightly, Erna clasped her hands, which were trembling nervously. Even the appearance of a small and slender body and dense facial features. She was a child who perfectly resembled her mother. It seemed that the only traces he left were brown hair at best. Walter Hardy, who swallowed dry saliva, looked at his daughter with a more tenacious gaze. Even in an absurd outfit, she's such a pretty child. If she's properly decorated, she would be quite a beauty. To be honest, she might not be far behind from Princess Gladys, in terms of beauty, whom the whole country revered with fuss. When the thought reached that point, Walter Hardy let out a brief exclamation without realizing it. It felt as if a large fortune that had been completely forgotten had rolled in. "Let's have our meal first." He said something completely different from his promise and looked at his wife standing next to him with a very serious look. "What are we going to do now?" Brenda Hardy, who opened her axes-like eyes, licked her lips and scolded him, but he didn't budge. "Let's talk a little bit more, honey. I think it will be a very important story." The Grand Duke's carriage returned only after the bright morning. At least in this Scharen palace, it was a scene of everyday life, nothing special. "Good morning, Mrs. Fitz." To Mrs. Fitz, who had a strict expression on her face, Bjorn gave a carefree greeting as usual. The faint smell of alcohol wafting through the fresh morning air deepened the wrinkles on Mrs. Fitz's forehead. "You are coming home very early, Prince." Despite her thorny answer, Bjorn only smiled softly. Bjorn, who showed his head bowed to the people in line, began to walk across the hall in stride. It was difficult to find traces of last night, which must have been not very healthy, anywhere in that straight and elegant posture. Mrs. Fitz sighed silently and followed after Bjorn. The invitation came from the royal palace. Mrs. Fitz, who was reporting on the relentless flow of invitations to social gatherings, added in an empowering voice. Bjorn, who had just reached the bedroom door, glanced over his shoulder and looked at her. "At the palace? Why?" This year's founding international ball contained the king's orders to attend and fulfill the duties of Grand Duke Scharen no matter what. He said that if the prince did not attend, he would hold all the employees of the Grand Duke's residence responsible. Doesn't this sound more like a threat than an invitation? Bjorn opened the door with a dry smile. His red eyes and his slow gait showed a feeling of fatigue that did not match the lively morning atmosphere. Every May, the founding ceremony of Luchen is held. The royal ball, which marked the beginning of the year, was a grand event that drew the attention of all social circles. There were not a few stupid nobles who were preparing for a full year for that day. After the abdication of the throne, Bjorn was no longer present. It seemed that the will of the elders of the royal family had changed when they saw that the absence of participation, which had been tolerated, was brought into question again. The reason is probably Gladys. It must be the name that gets a lot of attention these days. Bjorn slowly took off his jacket and untied his tie while the maids who followed put up the thick curtains to block the sunlight. "Do you have any ladies you like?" Towards the end of the Royal Hospital's charity party, her mother asked him, "I don't think you'll think that one divorce is not enough." Bjorn responded with a moderately light and witty joke. His mother's eyes, looking at him slowly, deepened with an unconcealable concern. The reason the invitation suddenly flew in was probably this. Bjorn took off his shirt haphazardly and threw himself on the bed as if collapsing. The maids, who closed the last curtain, retreated with minimal footsteps. Bjorn, who was silently staring at the ceiling, quickly closed his eyes. The sound of regular breathing began to seep into the dark and quiet bedroom. "Don't think about it anymore." The answer to the question she asked after squeezing out all her courage came after 4 days. If that was the only answer today, Erna was going to give up cleanly. It's impossible for her to sit down like an uninvited guest for so long. It was difficult to bear because she was worried about her grandmother, who would be worried because of her granddaughter, who left just one letter and left as if she was running away at night. "Would I feel better if I went for a walk?" Erna thought deeply and soon changed her mind. When she thought of yesterday afternoon when she went out for a walk because she couldn't stand the frustration, her hands were still trembling. A man she met in the plaza kept talking to her and chased after her, so Erna had to run away frantically. Miss Erna. You do it again, miss. The young maid, who introduced herself as Lisa, was in charge of carrying out Erna's care. She was a friendly girl with an impressive smile on her face. Erna was thankful for taking good care of her in many ways, but it was a little strange for Erna to deal with people her age that she hadn't met in a long time. It was the first time after Pavel had left his hometown to attend college. Come to think of it, she heard that the city where the Royal Academy of Arts is located is Scharen. Belated regret came along with the sudden memory. She wished she had brought Pavel's address. She didn't have time to think about it because she was leaving as if she was on a night escape. The town of Baden was located in the most remote part of the country village. It was like a secluded island where one had to walk an hour to the nearest neighboring village. The Bardens of Baden, who had turned their backs on the world, lived there, and Erna, who had grown up with them, did the same. It would not be an exaggeration to say that plants and livestock were more familiar to her life than humans. Without Pavel, it certainly would have been.
Excusez-me, Lisa.
When Erna carefully called out her name, the maid's eyes lit up. Yes, miss. Please speak. Is the Royal Academy of Arts near here? It is about 5 stops away by stagecoach. Will you be going there?
No.
It's not like that. I was just curious. Erna quickly shook her head. It seemed rude to suddenly visit Pavel. She was in a situation where she had to stay quietly and leave instead of doing whatever she wants to do. By the way, Lisa, is there something going on with the Hardy? I think the atmosphere is a bit cluttered. Erna, who sat with her posture fixed, carefully asked what she had been curious about. What? Well, it's fine. The maid quickly changed her expression and avoided her gaze. I don't know about that, miss. Really, I haven't been to this mansion for a while. Therefore, so I don't know. It was then that an unfamiliar maid's voice was heard along with the knock. Lady, the master is looking for you. It was the message that Erna had been waiting anxiously for. Father granted her request. He said he would buy the country house inherited from Thomas Baden and hand it over to Erna. Erna was so startled that she almost lost her senses. It was her last hope, so she recklessly hung on it, but she never thought that it would come true so easily. Of course, she has to pay the price, so it can't be a fortune that she got for free. As a condition of granting her daughter's request, Viscount Hardy made an unexpected offer. Let's live in the same house now as a proper family. Even so, he said that leaving his daughter in a distant place until she became a young lady who was at marriageable age was the thing that bothered her. 1 year. Give this father only that much time. When Erna hesitated, her father added hastily, let's stay in Scharen for about a year, go out in social circles, and take time to expand the network we need in the future. It seems to me that it is the father's duty to provide you with at least that level of foundation. When she blinked, the Viscount came to help. His explanation that he would help a young girl to live like a noble family was fervent, but to Erna, they were nothing more than meaningless illusions. Erna liked the quiet life in a place where today, like yesterday and tomorrow, not different from today and continuing like that. If these days of life were completed as beautifully as a patchwork quilt made by her grandmother, there was nothing more to wish for. Still, she agreed because it was the best thing to do. Erna wanted to protect her house at all costs. Even if it was a foolish insistence, it was fine. It wasn't too bad a deal to get the house in exchange for staying with her father for about a year. The conversations of the drinking party returned to horse racing. The children of prestigious families, who are members of the social club, met each other, so whenever they talked, they were half crazy and spoke enthusiastically. When the story of the winner of the last horse race came out, a mixture of envy and jealousy focused on Bjorn. The stallion owned by the Grand Duke was winning the kingdom's various horse races. In fact, the horse doesn't even show up well on the racetrack. Bjorn, if you are not interested in horse racing, how about selling it? Even if you pay a huge price, there will be people waiting in line. First of all, I will line up for you. Then I'll give you 1.5 times what that bastard is asking for. Everyone was excited and waited for Bjorn's answer. I have no interest in horse racing. Bjorn put down the emptied glass of wine at once and responded calmly. Everyone's eyes were now gleaming with anticipation they couldn't hide. I'm not going to sell it though. You are not interested, so why? Because it's mine. At Bjorn's blunt reply, sighs erupted from everywhere. All sorts of conciliation and persuasion followed, but Bjorn, as always, just listened indifferently. You're a prince who doesn't even listen to what other people say. Peter shook his head and smirked. What's the logic of not selling it because it's yours even if it's not interesting? Anyway, you are a pervert. While grumbling with a grimace, Peter was quite friendly and filled the empty glass. The men's topic that had been heating up with horse racing for a while moved to women's stories as if it were a natural procedure. Bjorn glanced at the grandfather clock placed in the diagonal direction and sat cross-legged with his chin on the table. Ah, the new maid in the Hardy family is really cool, isn't it? When the names of socialite ladies who were famous for their beautiful looks were gone, someone suddenly threw in new firewood. Are you going Hardy? The family couldn't afford to hire a new maid now. The maids who were there must have left the house. Then, is it the maid he has been with for a long time? Anyway, she is a maid for sure. I saw her go into that house. What? Have you followed her already? What do you mean by following? We met by chance on Terra Avenue, and I thought I should say hello because she is so beautiful, but she got scared and ran away, so I couldn't ask her name. She looked like a country girl at first glance, but she was very timid. To scare a beautiful woman, your face is ugly. Look, if it was our prince. Even a cowardly country girl would have greeted sweetly like honey. Shut up. Silent stories of giggles and exchanges spread along with the scent of alcohol. Hardy. Hearing the name he hears often these days, Bjorn stood up from his seat. The brandy in the glass he held in one hand shook with the rhythm of his steps. She is the prettiest girl you'll ever work with. If you see her, you will definitely agree with me. Brenda Hardy glanced at the table clock, trembling nervously. Always during important times like this one, she will go out for a walk. She was a kid that the Viscountess didn't like in many ways aft. That has to be the case, Viscount. Countess Meyer's gaze, who was looking down at the landscape of the garden through the window, turned to Brenda Hardy. Otherwise, you are wasting my time, and I hate wasting my time on pointless things. Contrary to her soft voice, her eyes were cold. Suppressing her upset stomach, Brenda Hardy smiled as she struggled. It's a pity that this situation has to be endured by being patient. Countess Meyer was a standing figure who was known as a legend in the Luchen socialite marriage market. Born as the daughter of a humble half-baron, she rose to the rank of countess and succeeded in marrying into a family that was so great with even making her daughters marry into a great family. The eldest daughter became the countess, and the second daughter became the wife of the wealthy merchant. She even succeeded in finding a good husband for the girls and her chaperone, and when the rumor spread, women from all walks of life started lining up. It was almost a miracle that such Victoria Meyer was now sitting in the living room of the Hardy family. Originally, she announced that she would not be taking the chaperone this season, so that she could spend the summer with her second daughter abroad. However, plans went awry when the second daughter went on a long trip with her husband. Erna Hardy had to mobilize all her contacts before another family could take her away. He wants to sell his dot. Even when she first heard it, Erna Hardy thought her husband had finally gone insane. But he was pretty serious, and even that ambition had a pretty plausible corner. For a family driven to the edge of a cliff to offer their daughters for sale at the wedding market, there was nothing special in the social world. In fact, all marriages in the social world are all transactions in the end. Of course, exposing blatant business practices is somewhat of a low-class thing, but the current Hardy family was not in a position to judge such a thing. Above all, Erna. That girl was sure to be a top-notch sale. In the end, Erna Hardy accepted her husband's crazy proposal, pretending not to win. This kind of business is supposed to be a speed game, so they were going to see a match by the end of this summer somehow. Madam, Miss Erna has arrived. Just as the wrinkles between Countess Meyer's forehead were noticeably deepening, a maid brought good news. Erna Hardy got up from her seat, forgetting her face for a moment. Come here, Erna. I waited a long time. As she entered the drawing room, she handed her a sincere greeting. Countess Meyer, who put down the fan, also turned her head to look at Erna. Even after buying a bunch of new clothes, Erna was still wearing a rustic dress. Come here and say hello. Countess Meyer. Erna Hardy brushed up on Erna with an anxious voice. When she saw a stranger, she looked like a hardened countryman. Look how she reacts. Her blood almost dried up for fear that Victoria Meyer would leave her seat at any moment. Hello, Mrs. My name is Erna Hardy. Erna, who approached with a crouch, luckily greeted her with proper manners. Countess Meyer's eyes were as sharp as a blade, carefully examining Erna from top to bottom and from bottom to top. How is she, madam? Do you like our Erna? Erna Hardy, who could not stand the silence, broke down first. I guess you are not lying. Countess Meyer, who had a strange look, nodded her head, and slowly, with an elegant gesture, she got up and walked towards Erna. Nice to meet you, Miss Hardy. Let's try to do it well. The Countess reached out her gloved hand in front of Erna and asked for a handshake. My name is Victoria Meyer. I will be in charge of Miss Hardy's chaperone. When the noise of the scissors cutting the fabric ceased, the bedroom fell into silence again. Concentrate on your work when your head is cluttered. It was Erna's old habit. After helping Mrs. Grieve to make and sell artificial flowers, it was natural to grab scissors when caught in thoughts. It was useful in many ways because she could make up my mind and earn a living. It's a little funny that she brought her work all the way here, but to Erna, these things now felt like a part of her body. Maybe it's not going to be a very smooth year, Erna thought. It had already been 10 days since she moved to the Hardy family's mansion. Each day seems to go by very slowly, but the 10 days of each day just flowed by like a torrent. After arriving in Scharen, Erna spent most of her time with the Viscount. To be more precise, it might be more accurate to say that she was dragged around. It was because Erna was not given any choice while going to and from the many colorful shops and buying piles of things. It was all about putting on, taking off, and being bailed from place to place. It was like playing with a doll. Lady, I was surprised to know where you went. I'm sorry if I caused you concern. That doesn't mean you have to apologize. Embarrassed, Lisa waved her hands and clapped. Erna, who smiled a little shyly, slowly approached the table where afternoon tea was served. Lisa, who was hesitating, also approached her. Next time, bring another teacup. It was during tea time 4 days ago that Erna suddenly said something absurd. Lisa, who understood the meaning of those words too late, almost screamed in shock. "Don't do this to me, miss. If that's the case, you will get in trouble." "Why? I've been having tea time with Mrs. Grieve in the Baden family." No matter how hard she tried to explain, Erna only tilted her head with a blank face like now. "Who is Mrs. Grieve?" Lisa lowered her voice and asked nervously. "The housekeeper of the Baden." Erna, who held her breath at the same time, responded in earnest. The secret tea time with the young lady that started like that had been going on peacefully for several days. "She's definitely a bit of a weird girl." Lisa somewhat agreed with what the Hardy servants were whispering. The young girl of the Hardy family, who suddenly appeared one day, had no aspects of an aristocratic lady. From her appearance to her attitude, it was in every way. However, such accusations of being arrogant or eccentric were pure absurdity. She hides her face a lot and doesn't talk much, giving the impression of a childish, but looking at her closely, she was a pretty sweet girl. "Wow, did you make that?" Lisa's eyes widened when she discovered the coveted harmony placed on the desk where she unintentionally threw her eyes. Erna blushed a little and nodded her head. The shadow of her long eyelashes, which swayed with each slow blink, was like a butterfly flapping her wings. "So pretty. You're really good at it. I would believe it even if it was a real flower." Lisa was truly amazed. When she met Erna's face, who was happy with the compliment and smiled broadly, Lisa felt a bit dazed. "Sell and sell. Now you're trying to sell your daughter, huh?" When Viscount Hardy suddenly wanted to bring the daughter of his ex-wife, who had left home, into this house, the employers often murmured such accusations. Obviously, they will sell for a pretty high price, so that's good enough. No matter what they sell, isn't it good for all of us that this family is still alive? Some even secretly attacked the owner. With the young lady like this, Lisa seemed to be able to understand the meaning of those bad words. Does this lady know about this? A question that suddenly came to mind disturbed Lisa. It was at that time that Erna, who had come to her side at some point, suddenly brought out harmony. "Are you going to give it to me?" When asked in disbelief, Erna nodded her head slightly. "No, miss. I didn't mean it that way. I'm just pretty. I'll give you a present. It will be pretty if you put it on your hat. It can also be used as a brooch." In Lisa's perplexed hand, Erna gave the harmony directly. Lisa, unable to refuse the sincerity, decided to accept the gift, pretending not to win. At that moment, Erna smiled in relief. She was a pretty girl smiling like a flower she had made. "Shall we go for a walk? Scharen must still be very unfamiliar and awkward, but in return for the gift, I will show you a lot of good places." Lisa jumped up from her seat with a renewed enthusiasm. Erna looked up at her with her round eyes. "Maybe I'm causing trouble?" "I can't. It is my job to take good care of her." Lisa, who smiled brightly, quickly brought Erna's parasol and hat. "Come on out, miss." Scharen was a large city second to the capital. The nobility usually had their mansions in the southern part of the city, where the Scharen Palace, the royal summer residence, was also located. From densely packed high-end shopping districts and hotels to luxurious theaters, it was a bustling downtown boasting the splendor of a resort town where famous nobles of the kingdom come to enjoy the summer season. A little further north, there is a huge port that connects to the ocean, so Schwerin has been a city where commerce and finance have developed since ancient times. Erna listened to Lisa's exasperated chatter and took a slow pace. It was something she knew from reading books, but when she looked at this city with her own two eyes, everything felt new. "That hotel is the best hotel in Schwerin." Lisa paused for a moment and pointed to the hotel located at the intersection of 3 avenues. The restaurant and tea room over there are very popular among the ladies here. See you next time, miss." Before Erna could even reply, Lisa quickly added. Erna nodded her head gently, as she liked to see her face full of anticipation. It was then that a tall man caught her eye. The man who came out of the entrance of the hotel walked with a wide stride. The woman standing next to me didn't care what she said to me and just hurried my way. Behind these two men followed suitably spaced users. Seeing the attention of passers-by all at once, he seemed to be a fairly famous figure. "Oh no, miss." Erna, possessed by a strange feeling of dizziness, turned to face the man, and Lisa grabbed her arm. "Yes, miss. It's nice to see. I know that feeling well, but I still can't. I can't use it." Lisa frowned, and now her tongue clenched. Tilt her head at the unfamiliar words, Erna shifted her gaze to the blonde man again. The wagon carrying him and the woman soon disappeared over the other side of the highway. "Because it's never going to happen." Lisa took a deep breath and stopped in front of Erna. "Who is that person?" "That? You don't even need to know that." "Don't know." "Do you have a bad reputation? Ugh. Tell me, what are you doing?" Lisa shook her head and grabbed Erna's shoulder. "Remember, miss. Not him, that one then." "Well, that's right, a poisonous mushroom," Lisa shouted with her eyes twinkling. Even though he said absurd words, he had a more serious expression. "Remember, miss, if you eat it, you die." Only a long time later did I understand that warning. The breakthrough started with the dress. It was the dress for Erna Hardy's debutante to be worn at the royal palace. Brenda Hardy looked at Erna's dress with a slightly perplexed look. In terms of being pure white, she faithfully followed the tradition of debutante, but the appearance was not at all docile. How deep was the neckline? It was a scene where she would make her debut by showing half of her shoulders and breasts to the whole social world. Anyway, she's an unusual woman. Brenda Hardy mumbled with a sigh. It was Countess Meyer who suggested such a dress. Her opinion about how a more modest, that is, an ordinary debutante dress, would be completely ignored. It would be great to see a young girl making her debut when she turned 20, wearing the same dresses as her younger siblings. She was angry all the way to the tip of her head, but since it was the truth, it was hard to find words to refute. In the spring of around the age of 15, the girls of the noble families of Lechen made their social debut at the founding party. Although sometimes they were delayed for about a year due to personal reasons, there has never been a lady who made her debut so late. Although there were excuses made that it was because she was weak and lived in the countryside, no one would believe it. So, if she is going to stand out anyway, it's better to make an unconventional move. Brenda Hardy, who had hardened her heart, rang the bell on the table. The maid, who had left for her errand, soon returned with a young maid who served Erna. For Erna, you have a job that you have to take responsibility for. Can you do it? Yes, ma'am. Just leave it to me. The maid with a nervous face answered loudly. All right, that's a great attitude. Nice to see. With only a smile on her lips, Brenda Hardy slowly got up and walked towards the maid. Let me put this dress on Erna. If you don't bring Erna in this outfit before the departure time, you'll be fired. Bjorn woke up earlier than usual. Yes, it was noon, which was far from the usual wake-up time, but for him it was like an early morning. It is good, my prince. Thanks to this, the servants of the Grand Duke's residence were able to avoid the tragedy of being rebuked by His Majesty the King. Mrs. Fitz made an unusual joke to Bjorn, who had just come out of the bathroom. There was also a gentle smile on her face, which seldom showed emotion. Bjorn smiled brightly and walked into the dressing room with a wide stride. The servants, who were preparing the clothes, stopped working for a moment and then turned back and bowed their heads. There was no more smile left on Bjorn's face as he responded to the greeting with a light nod. As Bjorn, who had changed clothes, stood in front of the mirror, the attendants began to move busily. The sunlight shining through the window became brighter as they went out with the complicated and colorful formal attire. Bjorn looked at the golden dust floating in the light with narrowed eyes. Even if at least one troublesome prince doesn't show up, tonight's ball will go on without any problems. Bjorn was well aware that his father's threats were just bluffs. The revered King Philip III of Luchen, his benevolent father, could not do such a thing like put a sword to his throat. Nevertheless, he decided to attend. The price of having everything equipped and enjoying a smooth life is a law that must be paid, maintaining the minimum amount of responsibility that was different from bondage. It was the proper line of life he had been keeping as administrator. "It's done, Prince," the deacon, who adjusted the shape of the last veil, said slowly. Bjorn caught a glimpse of his own reflection in the mirror and turned around. Just by gently pulling up the corners of his lips, his face changed in an instant. Bjorn began to take a refreshing step towards the central porch of the Grand Duke's residence, where the carriage was waiting. The faces of the attendants who followed were lit with the light of admiration and joy that they had recovered after much effort. "It's all because of you. Because of you." As the palace began to appear across the street, Erna Hardy burst into anger. Viscount Hardy, who barely sighed, glared at his wife as if embarrassed. "What? Now do you want to blame me and say that I am responsible for other people's wagon accidents? If you hadn't taken left our townhouse in the capital with bank debt, we wouldn't have entered the palace in such an unsightly manner on the day of the prom." Viscount Hardy, who was tired of his wife's voice who was raising her voice without losing, couldn't resist any more and shut his lips firmly. In the midst of the commotion, Erna only looked out of the window with a half-dazed face. Scharen was a city adjacent to the capital, Bern. It was said that it was not too far to go by wagon, but their arrival had been very delayed more than expected due to the accident. It was obviously a big deal that the ball had already started, but to Erna, even that fact seemed like a distant world. It would have been better if the road had not been opened forever. Erna looked down with eyes that were about to cry. To arrive at the royal palace wearing such a shameful dress. She felt like jumping off the carriage. As soon as Erna saw the dress, she resolutely refused. If it wasn't for Lisa, who cried and begged her not to go back to the countryside, saying that she would be kicked out as of today if she didn't wear this dress, she would never have worn such vulgar thing. Erna, who could not go to the ball as if she was naked, and could not let the innocent maid out, offered a compromise of her own. It was to cover the shoulders with a lace shawl. Although not very pleased, the Viscount, fortunately, took a step back and gave in to her. "You have to do well with what you learned, Erna. Do you understand?" As the carriage passed the grand entrance of the palace, Viscount Hardy insisted on it. "Learn. What did you learn?" Erna tried to retrieve her memory somehow, but it didn't work out as she wanted. Erna's two hands clutching the lace shawl wrapped around her shoulders were trembling as if they had convulsed. "Viscountess, what the hell is this?" Countess Meyer exclaimed nervously when she saw the Hardy family rushing up the stairs. It was after the royal couple had already arrived and the introduction of the young girls who were debuting this season had ended. It turned out like this because of a wagon accident. Are we really late? What is this shawl?
I'm sorry, madam.
This was the best we could manage. Brenda Hardy, who was paying attention, quickly made excuses. At best, Erna had her upper body covered with a shawl, hiding the purpose of the beautiful dress. I wouldn't have been able to get this kid in the wagon without a shawl. You couldn't imagine how stubborn she was, making lousy excuses. Countess Meyer shook her head nervously, grabbed Erna's wrist first, and hurriedly started climbing the stairs. She couldn't handle this little, weak girl. Brenda Hardy's incompetence made her shake with anger. "Countess, give me a little bit of time." "Hey, Miss Hardy. His Majesty the King is already here. How much more time do you need?" Erna sighed and begged, but Countess Meyer did not waver. Anyway, it was impossible to get rid of this kid's rustiness in that short amount of time. Rather, the odds of winning are higher if the appearance of an innocent country girl is presented as a charm. "Please tell me." She gave orders to the servants guarding the front of the banquet hall. The heavy door engraved with the white wolf crest, which symbolizes the Dniester royal family, slowly opened and dazzling lights and noises poured out. The house of Viscount Hardy arrives. Following the servant's loud voice, the eyes of the nobles who filled the spacious hall were focused on them all at once. At that moment, Victoria Meyer had a gut feeling that this side would benefit far more from appearing like this than being introduced as one of the many young ladies. This crisis turned into an opportunity. Countess Meyer, who exchanged glances with the Viscount Hardy, who followed them in a hurry, took the shawl from Erna, who froze like a statue. Erna, who realized this too late, struggled to capture it, but it was nothing more than a gesture to no avail. "Let's go, Miss Hardy." Countess Meyer pushed Erna's back with all her might with a cold command. The beautiful prize she was given this season was tossed aimlessly into the dazzling light. She couldn't breathe well. That was all Erna could barely think of. Even when she was just standing silently, her heart was pounding like it was going to explode and her breath caught up in her throat. Erna, who barely supported her shaking legs and took a step, came to a stop again after a while. It was because she remembered what she looked like. Erna looked around as if asking for help, but all that caught her eye were unfamiliar faces and dizzying lights. After a while, it faded like a painting which got smeared. What should I do? Erna looked around once more, trembling helplessly like a prey thrown into a den of wild beasts. It was then that the servant's cry could be heard, announcing the arrival of a new guest, amid the murmur of onlookers. "Prince Bjorn is entering." The ripple caused by that name swept the entire banquet hall in an instant. The Viscount Hardy and Countess Meyer, who followed Erna while keeping their distance intentionally, looked back with bewildered faces. They never dreamed that there would be guests who had not arrived yet, even more so that it would be Prince Bjorn. They retreated first. The red carpet rode from the entrance of the banquet hall to the opposite end, to the stage where the king and queen sat side by side, now belonged to Prince Bjorn.
No.
They just knew that until they found Erna, the troublesome brat they had forgotten for a while. "Oh my God, look at that child." Brenda Hardy clasped her husband's arm with a pale blue face. Erna, who lost herself in a panic attack, frozen, was standing in the middle of the carpet, blocking the prince's path. In order to bring that child, they had to outrun Prince Bjorn, and it was hard to tell which choice would be more horrific. Meanwhile, the distance between the prince and Erna was getting smaller and smaller. Erna turned around at the shadow cast over her. "What the hell is this?" Bjorn's head tilted slightly as he looked down at the woman who was doing something absurd. When he first saw that woman, he didn't think much of it. Of course, she will back down, move away, and if he passed by like that, she would be just one of the countless others. He hoped that the woman he did not know would disappear from before him. Bjorn lowered his gaze, which had been wandering aimlessly in the air. But a strange woman was still standing in his way. Not knowing what to do, she was just trembling like a young beast driven to a hunting ground. When Bjorn, who had no desire to participate in this skit anymore, took a step, the woman's body, who had been gasping as if strangled, staggered. Even as he sighed, Bjorn nimbly supported the woman. It is not his business to talk about today's affairs, but the rumor that the Grand Duke even stunned a woman in the royal palace would be absurd. Breath, Bjorn whispered lowly to the woman who was turning blue. Slowly raising her head, the woman looked surprised, as if she had only seen him for the first time. The tears in his red eyes seemed to stand out even more because of the lack of blood on her face. Breath, like a child learning an unfamiliar word, the woman repeated his words over and over again. Her small lips were also as red as tears. Breathe, breathe. Bjorn lowered his voice a little and whispered slowly. The woman nodded her head and then took a proper breath. She was still shaking, but fortunately she seemed to have escaped the danger of losing consciousness. Breath. The woman mumbled the words he had heard over and over again, steadily taking deep breaths and exhaling repeatedly. The white shoulders that shook with the rhythm were absurdly small and thin.